Hello everyone, this is Mondan Nagavan. This video we are going to see what is exception handling in Java. So before jumping into the exception handling in Java, we will try to understand what is exception in general. Just consider the simple scenario recording this video. So when you're recording this video, there will be the different kinds of exception that might happen. For instance, your power source goes down, or let's say the internet service provider stops the service for some time for maintenance, or let's say some construction work is going on nearby your house, which makes the disturbance. However, whatever may be the source of the exception, we need to handle that exception so that the flow of our recording will go smoothly. The same way when you consider with the Java exception handling, there will be a lot of exception that might happen when you execute the programs. If you don't handle that exception properly, that might stop your execution flow abnormally and it will come out of the execution flow, which is not the expected behavior of Java program. So in that case, we are going to handle that exceptions. So now we have just generally understood what is exception and how to handle that by using the different keywords. So what are those keywords? For instance, you can consider these keywords inside the Java, which will be used to handle the exception very properly. Try, catch, finally, throws, and throws. So if you consider about the try, which will be holding the block of the risky code or which might cause the exceptions. Similar to the exception block, you will be having the catch block. So catch block is nothing but whenever you have the exception got created inside your try block, it will be throwing the exception. So throwing the exception, it's something like it is not throwing something literally out of the block. It will be creating the information about your exception. But just stop it here. You consider the Java as the programming language, you will tell like everything is the class. So whatever the communication, whatever the things you have internally inside your Java, everything is a form of object, which has obviously the class. All right. So when you try to get the information about the exceptions, so even that will be under the form of class and object. So that's why we have the different kinds of classes for the exception inside the Java, which we will be discussing in the next slide. But simple here, you can consider you have some code block which comes under the try and it will create the exception and it will be in the form of object, which is the exception class. Then that object will be given to the catch block. So now the catch block gets that exception and it will be handling in a very proper way so that the program does not stop abnormally. It continues the flows continuously. Now we are clear about try and catch, where try is the source of the exception if it happens, and catch is the block where you will handle that exception, right? Then what about finally? Finally is something like whether the exception happens or not in your execution flow, there will be a set of activities should be done at any cost. For example, closing the closing the database connection, closing the file operations, and let's say even you are just connecting with the cloud, so disconnecting from the cloud, there are a lot of other things. So right, so those kind of activities should be done whether the exception happens or not, right? To avoid the cost of billing, or let's say to avoid the usage of the databases, or to avoid the locking of the files. So those set of activities will be done under the finally. So now we have seen what is try, catch, finally, which means that you are totally handling the exception by yourself. Fine. And next one will be the throw keyword. So throw keyword is something like we have discussed if the exception happens in the try block, the exception will be thrown in the form of object. But sometimes you yourself want to throw some exception synthetically, or let's say you want to throw the exception synthetically for your own kind of business logic exception. So at that time you will be creating your own exception model, which means that you are creating your own exception class and you are creating the object, you are giving the basic details and you are throwing that object. So in that scenario, you will be using the throw keyword. However, in coming sessions, we will be seeing how to create our own exception, how to use the keyword called throw. And next one will be the throws. So far, we have seen very active way of handling the exceptions, which means that we are just facing the exception, we are getting the object details, we are handling that exception, and we are closing that. But however, there is another way, which will be the lazy way. That means that You are not handling any exception in your code with a TriCatch finally, but you are simply saying that I don't want to handle that exception. I am just delegating the responsibility of handling the exception to the user of that method or caller of the class. So which means that you are just throwing this responsibility to the user or the caller of the method. So that let's say if you are having some utility method, let's say get details, and you are having some risky code inside your get details method, which is handling the files, then obviously you will need to handle that file handling code with the try catch finally, or you can throw that exception to the end user. So which means that whoever calls that get details method in their code, they need to handle with the try and catch and finally other again cascaded way, even they can handle, or even they can throw it to the next level who is calling that specific method. So it will be considered like a delegating cycle. So we will be seeing all these things in the practical. So in simple, the Java exception can be summarized in 5 keywords called try, catch, finally, throws, and throws. So in the previous slide, we have discussed that the exception even is just like an object inside your Java, which means that it has the classes. So for exceptions, we have the different kinds of classes inside the Java, such as like throwable, exception, error, which has the subclasses again internally, runtime exception, input output exception, and SQL exceptions, and so on. But however, the uppermost level will be the object, and for all the exception classes, the uppermost level will be the throwable. All right. So here you can see two different color, which is like red and green. The red will be considered like a checked exceptions, and unchecked exception will be considered like a green. So what do you mean by actually the checked exception or unchecked exception? A checked exception is something like at the compile time itself, it will be just predicting these kind of exceptions might happen. So you need to handle at the compile time itself. Just take a simple example. You are just opening a file from your directory and it will be considered like a checked exception, because you can see clearly here, you are seeing the throwable followed by the exception. Under the exception, you can see the input output exception, which is in red, which means that it is a checked exception. So wherever you are making the input output ways, so there it might be a chance that you will be getting the input output exception. So what is actually input output exceptions? So in simple, it means that whenever you are making some file transaction or let's say some file handling, the exception can happen. Since it's a checked exceptions, the compiler will tell that you need to handle the exception at the compile time itself. If you don't handle, either by using the try catch finally block or just throws with the delegate option, it will not allow to compile that code. This is the specialty about the checked exceptions. Whereas unchecked exceptions, you can see only at the runtime, but still it's the exception. So this will be the very major category about the exceptions. Whereas in error, you don't have any control over the error because it depends on the Java virtual machine or let's say the system level of informations or the details. So we cannot handle the error in Java exception handling because the name itself is exception handling. So we are not considering the error. If the error happens, it will stop abnormally itself. So you cannot handle that error. So you are seeing some examples about here exceptions, but however, in the next slide, you can see some more examples about the exception examples, such as like under the input output exceptions, you can see end of file exception, file not found exception, interrupt input output exceptions. For example, under the runtime exception, you can see arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, class cast exceptions, and so on. So however, we are not going to see everything in practical, but we will be seeing each sample from each category. So let's jump into the practical and see what are the different ways we can see the exceptions, and we can create your own exception, and we can see different ways of handling the exceptions, such as like try catch finally or throws keyword. So let's start with practical. Here you can see the package called exception demo. Under the exception demo, we will be having the examples of compile time exception demo, my exception, and runtime exception demo. Just start with compile time exception. Here you have two methods under the class called compile time exception demo. One is main method, which will be the start point or entry point. Another one is the file read. So in the file read method, you will be having the set of instructions just to read the file and close that file. Since we have not seen the file handling in detail, we will consider these file lines just to open the file from your local directory and read that file and close that file. Simple as it is. But however, since we are interacting with the file system and which is related to the input output transactions, we will be having the different kinds of exception that might happen, right? So for example, just go to the first error, and here you can see now there is an exception, which is a file not found exception might happen. Since it's a checked exceptions you are seeing at the compile time itself. In Eclipse, you don't compile by yourself. By normally, it will be compiled internally by the Eclipse itself. So that's the reason it is comes under the compile time exception. Now the compiler is telling like the file not found exception might happen, which means that at the time of execution, the file may not be there or even the folder may not be there. So for that reason, it is telling you are just have a possibility that you don't find that file at the runtime. So now you have two options to handle that exception. One is like just making the TriCatch finally so that you can handle in the catch block if at all it happens in the runtime so that your program does not end abnormally. Other option will be like you can throws a declaration. So that means that at the declaration of the method itself, you can use the throws keyword so that whoever calling this file read method, they will be the responsible for handling that specific exception, right? So now we will consider the very easiest way, which will be like a throws keyword. Now we have throws for the file not found exceptions. We are seeing the next error. Here we are having the add throws declaration. We will follow the same thing. Here input output exceptions, which is the parent of all the exception related to the file operations. And next one, we are throwing the exception by ourselves synthetically by using the throw keyword. Just to demonstrate here, by using the throw keyword, even you can create your own exception object and you can just make that exception in your code. Here we are currently making the exception for the existing Java class, which is nothing but SQL exception. However, we can create our own exception. We can create the object for that. Even that object can be thrown from your code by using the keyword called throw. Okay, so since you are throwing these exceptions, you can have the option just to throws declaration because you are synthetically creating this exception, right? Let's say if it happens from the risky code, it will give two options, whether to manage with try catch finally block or throws keyword. Since you are creating the error purposefully here, you are not going to handle it here, right? So that's the reason it will be giving the option only for throws. So we are throwing this to the caller, or we are delegating this responsibility to the caller of the file read. So now we are fine, just save it. Now let's say here, let's remove this. Actually, I have tested previously. So let's say in the main method, you are calling the file read directly because it is a static method. So static method inside the static method, no problem. We are calling that. Since you are the caller of the file read method, you are the responsible to handle the input output exception or SQL exception. If you click on this error, you can see here clear. So here you can see add throws declaration. So here also you can just make it as a throws keyword so that even you are delegating to the caller of the main method. Now the question is, who is calling the main method? So we know where we will be calling the main method. But in general, if you come across the previous basic sessions, the main method will be called by the JVM by default. So the JVM will be handling that exceptions. But however, JVM will not handle any exceptions. It will be directly giving into the console whatever the exception that you are getting. Let's consider this one and try this method, or let's say try this class, execute, and here you can see. So let me maximize. Here you can see the Java file not exception happen at the main method, or let's say thread main. The path will be something here. So here you can see at the very top. So line number 12, it happened. If you just track it again, so this file read will be calling this method. So in this line it happened. So this will be happening at the file read, which will be the internal classes and methods that we don't worry about much, right? So in simple, it will give the entire stack. So wherever the exception happened, from there, the actual all the things. For example, it happened here, then that happened in the native method of some places here at the native method, which we may not have the code. And after that, we will be having the 2.11.11, which will be the child of the parent 153 code here, and 108 and 60. And finally, it comes to the line number 12. So it will be the original point. Internally, it calls the another way. So it goes to the line number 17 here. So line number 17, we are using the file reader, which will be from the Java side, that goes to the line number 60 in the file reader class, and so on. So it goes to the stack level. So now we have seen how to delegate by using the throws keyword, and we have seen how to throw our exception object by using the throw keyword. Fine. We will go to the next way. So for example, let's say you don't want to throw. Just remove this and remove here as well. Let's say let it be here. In this, you can have the at the let's say the main method level, we can create the TriCatch. Here you will be having two TriCatch. One is a TriCatch to specific exception, or you can have the try and multi-catch. So multi-catch in the sense, since you are having two exceptions to be handled, you can try with multi-catch. Here you can see, so the try will be having the risky code. The risky code, everything is wrapped inside the file read method. So that's the reason inside the try block, you can have only the file read. And after that, you are catching either input output exceptions or SQL exceptions. So in both scenarios, you are trying to print that trace. So in this way, you are handling that code. Either it can be input output exception or SQL exceptions, right? So this way you can have the mechanism for handling the exception for both the things. So this will be the normal compile time exception. Now we will go to the runtime exception. So runtime exceptions will not give any error at the compile time. For example, 0 divided by error, or let's say 1 divided by 0. So denominator cannot be 0. You will be getting the divide by 0 error. So which we may not get at the compile time. But let's say if we just run this program, Java arithmetic exception divided by 0. So which will happen only at the runtime. So this is the example of runtime exception, which you will not find at the compile time. Fine. So, and next one will be the my exception. So my exceptions, actually before going to my exception, we will just have the divide by 0, right? So I will just right click and source. There will be some options around by TriCatch black. Okay, no problem. We will just have the try block here. So try. Catch block here, it will be at the very parent level. So we will just convert into arithmetic exception. Okay, fine. And here we will be writing just. Actually, in real time, we will not make some exception handling, something like printing the exceptions into the console. We'll be actually handling with the proper steps. Okay, fine. So I think it should be fine. It's not required to print it. It will automatically print by itself, right? So let me remove this. Save it and format. Okay, fine. Now, before we had a code like we don't have the TriCatch block for the arithmetic exceptions. Just run it now. See, just point to be noted here is like at the time of compilation, you will not get any error, even though if you don't mention the TriCatch. But we know that it will happen only at the runtime. So we are making the TriCatch block for arithmetic exception and running again. See, here you can see the actual exceptions has been printed in the console, but it looks like similar to the previous one, but we are not making anything. For simplicity, just I will remove this code and let's say just a simple system.println. Let's say arithmetic error. Save it and again run it. Here you can see only the output, which will not make, because since the previous output is similar to the exception, so you may not find the proper way of finding the difference between the with the TriCatch and without TriCatch. So this way we can understand like the runtime exceptions can be occurring or can be giving the error only at the running time or when you execute. Whereas the compile time exceptions, when you compile time itself, it will give the suggestion to make you to handle with the TriCatch or with the throws keyword. Okay, fine. Now let's say we have seen two kinds of exceptions, compile time and the runtime. But let's say we want to create our own exceptions. But why do we need our own exceptions since we have already so many built-in exceptions? For a scenario, let's say you want to create your own exception for making the business logic exception. For example, let's say you want to create exception with error code 333, which is the bad business code exception. Just a simple scenario. So what we'll do is like the simple steps to create your own exception will be like you create your own class with the exception name. For example, in this case, it will be the my exception extends the exceptions. So you can extend any exceptions. For example, we are going to the very parent level exception, which is the exception class. If you expand, or let's say if you just to create the instance, or let's say extend the exception or runtime exception, or let's say the checked exception, any exceptions that we can discuss here. For example, let's say if you consider here, we are extending the exception. If you extend the runtime exception, which means that at the compile time, it will not give any error. At the runtime only, it will give the error. So just to demonstrate that one, we can see it here. Now we are extending the exceptions. So just consider exception is the checked or unchecked. Exception is the checked exception. So that means that you need to handle at the compile time itself, right? So, okay, fine, everything fine. So let's remove this or not, let remove here and save it. Here you can see make problem. So here I am just using the keyword called throw and I am throwing my exception. But however, my exception is the child of exception, which is the checked exception. So at the compile time itself, you need to handle. But in make problem method, you don't have any problem because you are delegating that responsibility to the caller of the method. So my exception will be thrown. But the caller is something like main method. So when you use the make problem, he's the caller, right? So you need to handle it either by try catch or declaration. Let's say I'm using the throws keyword. So I'm just throwing to the main method caller, which is nothing but our JVM. Just save it and execute. Here you can see exception, demo exception. So the bad business code exception 333. Another way to is just to handle that code. For example, let's say rather than throwing from the main method, just create with TriCatch, and in the TriCatch you can just mention start out e dot to string. So just to printing the information. Here you will be getting the string representation of the exception object. But when you create the, let's say the child exception, or let's say the custom exception, so what you do actually is like you will be creating the constructor and you will be calling the superclass constructor with the message that you want to delegate to the parent class, which is nothing but exception in our class. Right. So now let's remove all these things and sorry. Okay, fine. I will remove these throws also. And here also I will remove. So which means that now I have the exception, checked exception. So that's the reason the compiler is trying to tell the unhandled exception type my exception. But if I just change it to runtime, so what will happen is here, like you will not have any problem at the compile time because it will be the runtime. However, even though it is the runtime exception, at the time of execution or at the time of run, you will be getting the exceptions. So again, the similar approach you can handle. So you can try with try catch, or you can just delegate to the caller of the method. So in this way, we have seen the 5 major keywords: try, catch, finally, and we have seen throw and throws keyword. And when you have the multiple exceptions, so you can have the multi-catch block as well. And these are the very simple way. The execution flow will be starting with the try. If there is an exception, it will go to the catch block. Then it will be the finally block. If there is no exception, that try block will be executed, skipping the catch block. Since there is no exception, it will come to the finally block and it will execute. For instance, here, let's say we will go to the compile time exceptions, and here we will add finally block as well. Let's say start out. Just to demonstrate, finally we will add. And let's say now we have the exceptions, right? So with the exception, we will run and the finally block will be executed, right? Let's say I'm just commenting out all the things which will make the exceptions. let's say Control L, or let's say rather than commenting out, let's see what we can do. Okay, let me comment it out because there should not be any exception, right? So just comment it out and save it. Now there is no exceptions because there is no code available. So you can directly see finally method still executes. So which means that finally block will be always executed, either you have the exception or not. Right. So this way we have clearly understood 5 major blocks, which is nothing but try catch finally through one throws keywords. And we have seen the delegation methods from the actual method by using the throws declaration, or we can have it at the caller of the method as well. So this is all about the exception. So thanks for watching and have a great day.